All right. Welcome everyone to our quarterly roadmap presentation. We do still have people joining, so we'll probably give it another minute or two to let people trickle in here. All right, we're going to get started here in just about 1 minute. We still have people joining, so we'll give it another minute before starting. All right. Well, we are a couple minutes past the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome everyone to our April quarterly roadmap presentation. A few housekeeping items before we get started today. We do have the chat function enabled. So as we go through this presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to add those into the chat. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. So we do want this to be engaging, and if you have questions or thoughts, please post those there. Before we do get into formal things, I do want to call out this legal disclaimer. Please know that everything presented in the roadmap presentation today is forward-looking and it is subject to change. So did just want to mention that. And at the very start here, want to cover a brief agenda of what we're going to talk about today. Really, first of all, is the focus on risk recon third-party intelligence, some of the product enrichment and enhancement work that we are doing in coordination, in conjunction with Recorded Future, how we can strengthen the risk recon product by leveraging Recorded Future's best in industry threat intelligence. So there'll be a heavy focus on things like threat pressure that you see a little bit later here in the slide, what threat pressure will enable us to do in the future. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the recently released features and what we have planned for the second quarter of this year. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about threat pressure, what that will mean for risk recon from a licensing perspective, when that's going to be released, and what that will enable us to do. We have also continued to enhance and enrich our situational awareness capabilities. So we have Jonathan here today that's going to talk some about what we've done in situational awareness and where we think that's going to take us. And then finally, we do have some work we're doing around custom labels that will be coming soon. And so Andrew's going to spend some time focusing on that. All right. So one of the key things you're going to hear a lot at Risk Recon is this statement you see on the screen, which is third-party risk management is an intelligence operation. Know what matters, act first. What that really means is third-party risk management continues to change and involve more moving away from sort of static annual assessments and questionnaires that you're sending to, your most highest important vendors each year. And while that's, likely not going away anytime soon, we are seeing more emphasis on continuous monitoring and leveraging threat intelligence to enable our customers to be more proactive in risk mitigation and understand where they need to spend their time and focus their efforts to continue to mitigate risk and effectively manage their portfolio of third-party risks. So everything that we are going to be doing at Risk Recon is really geared around this statement and this belief that third-party risk management really is evolving from that practice of sort of a static once a year practice to a daily activity where threat intelligence and risk management is really essential to effectively manage your portfolios of third parties. All right. So to support that, really we've situated things around kind of four key pillars, four key ideals. And at the center of those is how we can enrich and enhance Risk Recon and Recorded Future together. I mean, these are two MasterCard products. Everything we do on a daily basis, we're working very tightly with our peers at Recorded Future. And so that really allows us to be the source of truth for third-party risk management. So at the top left, Recorded Future and by way of the work we're doing with Recorded Future, it really enables us to have best in industry threat intelligence. So for Recorded Future, they have over 4,000 threat actors they've analyzed and they continue to scan on almost a daily basis. And that covers a broad range of cyber attacks. So data breaches, cyber attacks is something that we've reported on for years here at Risk Recon. Recorded Future offers us a very similar capability, but by leveraging both of those capabilities together, will really will allow us to have best-in-class zero-day vulnerabilities. And so another thing I want to focus on is kind of the bottom right quadrant here. And that's really one of the key kind of strategic differentiators of Risk Recon. And that's really the accuracy of the data and the comprehensive capabilities at Risk Recon. So as I'm sure most people know, we're independently certified to an accuracy rate of greater than 99%. That means false positives in Risk Recon are less than 1%. And part of the reason for that is we source approximately 97% of the data in Risk Recon. We own that. So if there are false positives, we're able to mitigate those and remove those within our product. And that will continue to be the focus and one of the focuses moving forward as we enhance our capabilities with Recorded Future data. It's going to remain really important that the data and the accuracy of the data that you see in Risk Recon is maintained. But through this partnership with Recorded Future, we're going to be able to continue to add capabilities, specifically in the area of threat intelligence. So that's things like ransomware, extortion information, leaked credentials, and so some of those are some of the things you are going to start seeing, and that really will start with Threat Pressure and the release that's upcoming for Threat Pressure. So first thing I do want to focus on is some of the roadmap updates, some of the recently released items over the past 90 days. And so in January, we had several releases that were around privacy. So first is privacy risk in the European Union, and then some enhancements we have made to our privacy reporting capabilities, specifically around vendor detailed reports and vendor summary reports. In April, we did make some of the data from privacy available in our API endpoints, and we've also added multi-language support for French Canadian while making some accessibility improvements. And then in March, we released and continue to release what we call common asset mapping. What that really means is we are adding some of the asset attribution and discovery from Recorded Future into Risk Recon. So over the past couple months, you've seen several customer some release announcements come out around expansion we've made around adding Recorded Future hosts into Risk Recon that have expanded our different vendor profiles. We continue to add on to that. We've recently added Recorded Future domains into Risk Recon. And so by way of that, we've seen expansion in our IT asset profiles. All right. So with kind of the summary out of the way, we want to get into some of the features that have recently been released. And so first we're going to cover privacy. And Charlie, I'm going to pass it over to you to cover this.
Okay, thanks, Wes. So, like was mentioned in the previous slide, in January, we completed our initiative to deliver a variety of reports for our privacy risk customers. This includes a couple reports at the portfolio level, including the risk progress report, portfolio ratings report, um, and also the portfolio breach events and actions report and executive summary. For the risk progress, portfolio ratings, and the executive summary, this is all different ways to see privacy ratings at the portfolio level. Breach events and actions includes not only breach events, but also enforcement actions that have been acted on any vendors within your portfolio. We've also introduced a summary report and detailed report at the vendor level. The summary report includes privacy ratings, so the overall domain and criteria ratings. The detailed report includes those ratings as well as any privacy findings that we're attributing to those vendors. And we can go to the next slide. In February, we also completed our Privacy API initiative. This is a pretty robust privacy API offering that allows privacy customers and partners to retrieve all the data seen in the portal. This includes privacy ratings, findings, compliance data for GDPR and CCPA, breach events and enforcement actions, as well as integration routes to kind of link out to different pages within the privacy modules, and also license management. So you can add and remove privacy licenses for vendors within your portfolio. Some of these endpoints are net new, and others are just extensions of existing endpoints. And where it is an extension of an existing endpoint, we've added an optional risk dimension parameter that you can set equal to either cyber or privacy, depending on which risk dimension you want to retrieve data for. I'm not sure who's up next. Is it back to you,
Uh,
Wes?
it's back to me. Thanks,
All
Charlie.
right. Yeah, no problem.
All right. So a couple other items we're going to cover that was released in Q1. I am going to talk about some of the asset mapping enhancements that's ongoing, but we also want to focus on items that we're currently working on, some of these that are very close to being released. So on the platform side, first is going to be custom labels. So those are going to be sort of ways you can continue to customize and manage your portfolio. Currently, we have the concept of foldering in RiskRecon. We're also looking to add capabilities around labeling that gives more granular ability to sort of tag and report on different capabilities within your portfolio. Also, some enhancements to in-app announcements that we're going to be working on. And then on the cyber side of the house, we have several really cool things coming out. So obviously, situational awareness has been in the product for a little over a year. We do get a lot of customer requests, a lot of questions around when is that going to be available via the APIs. So that work is ongoing. That's something that should be coming out within the next month or two. So be on the lookout for that. Obviously, I've mentioned threat pressure many times already today. That is looking like it's going to be a early May, late April release. The development work for that is actually completed, and we're going through testing. And then we have several items around common asset mapping that we continue to work on. And really what that is trying to reach asset parity between RiskRecon and Recorded Future. So part of that is enhancing and adding domains from Recorded Future. Once that work wraps up, we're going to be moving on to adding net blocks from Recorded Future. The first kind of deep dive thing I do want to cover is around threat pressure, and that's around the work we're doing in integrating between RiskRecon and Recorded Future. But before I cover threat pressure, I want to talk more detailed about this concept of what we call common asset mapping, which is really kind of asset expansion and parity in RiskRecon. So today, when you go into RiskRecon, and the example you see on the screen is sort of the IT profile of MasterCard. When you look at an entity within RiskRecon, obviously we have the concept of the domains that are owned by an entity, the subdomains, the associated hosts and IPs and net blocks. That will continue to be maintained, but we want to expand on that by way of leveraging Recorded Future. So over the past few months, we've been in the process of adding and expanding that IT asset coverage. First, by adding hosts from Recorded Future into RiskRecon. So you've seen an expansion of really the host IT profiles within RiskRecon. So if you go into RiskRecon today and you look at MasterCard and then you navigate to Recorded Future, we want to show the same IT asset information in both systems. So this is the foundational work that's been going on sort of behind the scenes really for almost 2 quarters now. The team is now working on adding domains from Recorded Future into Risk Recon. So we're seeing some expansion of different license types. That they've started with kind of what we call our Discover level licenses. We're moving on to advisor licenses and then own enterprise licenses, which have the greatest depth of granularity of attribution and reporting. So you will continue to see some additions of IT assets, and really this is going to allow us to provide more robust coverage when you look at an entity and its IT footprint. So work there is ongoing. Once we wrap up domains, as I mentioned, we're going to be moving to adding net blocks from Recorded Future into Risk Recon and then expansion of IP addresses. I would estimate probably we'll continue doing this work for another quarter or so until we have asset parity between Risk Recon and Recorded Future. But why this is really important is it allows us to do things like threat pressure. And so threat pressure is something you'll likely see in the product probably within the next month. What this is going to be is it's going to be when you look at it from a portal standpoint, there's going to be a new tab within Risk Recon. When you go and you look at an entity, there's going to be this tab added for threat profile. And for all advisor and own enterprise licenses, this is going to be added at no cost, at no change to your license. This is going to be an additional capability that's added to Risk Recon. What this is, threat pressure, is essentially a summary of an organization's threat exposure. So in Recorded Future, they have the concept of risk rules, and what those essentially are there different categories of threat intelligence. So some examples of this could be leaked credentials out on the dark web, or a lot of chatter on ransomware sites, typo squatting, things like that, possible IT policy violations. So Recorded Future is monitoring on a daily basis for this threat intelligence, and then they report on that at a great level of granularity. We're pulling in some of those summary metrics. So the 6 categories you see on the screen, which are essentially cyber exploit signals, typo squatting. What typo squatting is essentially is making a domain look similar to another domain to trick users into going there. So instead of google.com, it could be Google, but instead of an L, it's the number 1. Attention on ransomware extortion sites, high risk vulnerabilities, and then possible IT violations and often exploited ports. So you're going to see these summary metrics across each of those 6 categories and across Recorded Future's risk rules. All of the different levels of threat are aggregated into this concept of threat pressure. So within Risk Recon, you will have this 0 to 100 numeric value. It is a little bit different than how we rate risk at Recorded Future. A high threat pressure value is a very bad thing. It indicates a high level of threat exposure, of threat pressure for an organization. So something like an 80 or a 90 is indicative of a high threat landscape for an organization, where a very low threat pressure typically indicates not a lot of threat exposure out on the dark web. Obviously, at Risk Recon, a higher numeric value indicates a strong cybersecurity risk posture. So there are some differences in the scale and how these are rated. But what threat pressure really provides is when we talk about risk at a high level, it's really the intersection of vulnerabilities, impact or asset valuation, and threat exposure. So if you look across those 3 factors, you need to have insight and intelligence for each of those 3 to really get a complete picture of risk. And so by adding threat pressure to Risk Recon, we're really providing additional insight into risk across all of these different categories. And so when we talk about Recorded Future, they really have the best in industry threat intelligence. And so by adding this to Risk Recon, we're really providing more granularity, more visibility across risk. So if you look at your portfolios, of vendors, maybe you're monitoring 300 or 400 vendors, and typically 3 to 5% of those or what customers call tier 1 vendors, which are their most critical or important vendors. Being able to understand which of those your most important vendors have a high threat landscape or a threat exposure really will help customers understand where their third-party risk teams and analysts need to spend and focus their time. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to really establish kind of the foundation or framework for some of the future work we will be able to do. I'll show a couple of those items immediately following this. So this is going to be in the product, as I mentioned, probably within the next month or so. Again, it's going to be advisor and own enterprise level licenses. This will be a standalone rating, meaning this is not going to impact or change the cybersecurity risk rating. It's not going to change the algorithm. This is just going to be a separate metric that will be added to each of the vendor pages. Probably the next thing we're going to do immediately following this is how we can enhance the portfolio by leveraging threat pressure. So that first will probably be adding threat pressure access to our API endpoints, but we will also want to summarize this and aggregate it at a dashboard level. So as a fast follow, you should start to see threat pressure added to the home portfolio landing page so you can get an idea when you look at the dashboard today, we have the portfolio performance summary. We want to add that same type of information for threat pressure. So that will be a fast follow. And then probably following dashboarding, we're going to be adding reporting capabilities and benchmarking by leveraging threat pressure. All right, but what threat pressure is also going to allow us to do, and what I'm going to show after this slide are some future facing ideas. So these probably aren't going to be second quarter, but there's going to be things that we're going to target in the second half of this year with threat pressure. And probably the first thing that we will look at is kind of the concept of overlaying this threat exposure, this threat pressure rating on top of our traditional trending graph on a entity page. So if you go into an entity page today, you can see the movement, the trend line of the cybersecurity risk posture over time. And so also, we've overlaid sort of data breaches, these red circles you can see on the screen here. When we do report on and discover a data breach, that's obviously reported on in the portal, but we also want to be able to visualize that. So we represent those as those red circles on top of the trend graph. But we also want to overlay this concept of threat pressure. And so that's the red line you see on the screen. And what that allows organizations to do is gain an understanding for the relationship between the cybersecurity risk posture and the threat exposure an organization might have out on the dark web. So as we all know, even organizations that are rated very high have an A or B cybersecurity risk rating. That doesn't mean they're impervious to cyber exploits. We've seen those organizations have data breaches and at times very costly and expensive data breaches. So by adding this concept of threat exposure, we'll be able to visualize and be more proactive when we look at an organization by seeing not just their cybersecurity risk hygiene, but also the relationship, the amount of threat exposure they have out on the dark web. And that will allow those third-party risk teams to more accurately determine where they need to spend their time and which vendors pose the greatest risk to their organizations. Following this overlay of the threat exposure on top of our trend graph, we're going to look at the concept of a threat-informed vendor priority matrix. So today, when customers come into RiskRecon, one of the first things they very frequently do is they go through that exercise of vendor tiering. So that's where they come in and they say, all right, of my portfolio of 200 vendors in RiskRecon, which of those are the most critical to my organization? So that typically takes place through sort of our foldering capabilities. And so they'll typically bucket those vendors into levels of criticality, which are represented on the left side of this axis, what's called the vendor criticality. That is then visualized against the security risk, so the overall cybersecurity risk rating for an organization. And those two data points in comparison give us our vendor priority matrix, which you can see an example of on the screen. But what we want to do is we want to add a third dimension to that, and that is visualized here in sort of this concept of threat pressure. This won't necessarily be done 100% the same way you see this on the screen. This is just a mock-up or wireframe. But one of the ways we're looking at doing this is by essentially adding the concept of layers. So you can look at your vendor priority matrix today, and maybe you want to filter that by only your vendors that have the highest level of threat exposure. So in the top right quadrant, maybe that gets you from 50 vendors down to 10 vendors. And why that's important is those are the 10 vendors that pose the greatest risk to your organization. Those are the most important vendors that if something were to happen to those vendors, it could equate to a disruption of your business operations. And so adding threat pressure will help to filter in more granularize where the greatest areas of risk are posed from those organizations. But where this gets really cool is when we look at our traditional risk priority matrix. So our risk priority matrix, and this is at a portfolio level. So if you go to the home dashboard today and you scroll down just a little bit, we have our risk priority matrix, which is essentially the intersection of the valuation of assets. So the assets we discover, when we discover those, we assign a value to those assets based on the type of information those assets are storing or processing. So assets that we discover that have things that are indicative of authentication are typically valued at or categorized at a high level of value where maybe you have a website, a marketing website that's collecting no usernames or passwords. That's typically going to be assigned a lower value. But then we intersect that with the severity of the issues we detect, and that those two data points together allow us to visualize and rank risk in comparison. So of my entire portfolio of risk of issues that we've discovered at Risk Recon. So on the screen here, this is roughly 300,000 issues. That gets us down from 300,000 issues to the 5,000, the 4,920 issues that are of the most importance. And while that's very impactful, it can be difficult to send 5,000 issues to, obviously this is distributed across an entire portfolio, but you can't effectively send 100 or 200 issues to a vendor and expect them to mitigate those. But if you could take this information and you could overlay that threat exposure, so maybe we filter this from essentially all levels of threat exposure down to only the most critical level of threat exposure. And so we're going to overlay the threat intelligence onto this risk priority matrix. And in this example, it would get us down from 5,000 priority one issues to maybe 328 issues that are the most important, that are actively being exploited or being talked about out on the dark web. Those are the issues that you need to focus your time on, that you need to work with your vendors to remediate. So the threat exposure information will really allow us to further refine and hone in on the issues that pose the greatest risk to organizations. So the last three slides I've shown you, again, those are forward-facing items. Those aren't likely to be released this quarter. These are probably second half of this year items. But I did want to give an example of the type of things, the type of product capabilities that we will be able to bring you all by leveraging the threat intelligence, the threat pressure data that we're going to be getting from Recorded Future. So be on the lookout for those. Be on the lookout for a release announcement around threat pressure. Again, that's coming out within the next month. So we're really excited about that. And again, that's going to be added to all advisor and own enterprise license types at no additional cost, no change to your agreement with Risk Recon. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about our enhancements to situational awareness, some of the work that John and his team have been doing for situational awareness. So John, I will go to the next slide and I will pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Wes. So I am here to talk about situational awareness. On the left here, you will see some of the recent advisories that you can go into your portal and get details about your portfolio exposure. We've got a Cisco SD-WAN advisory. We have one for OpenClaw, React RSC, and also Mongo Bleed. And as always, we're hunting for more advisories to publish. So if there is a vulnerability that you don't see that you're interested in, please reach out to us to get details. We are also looking at enhancing our data curation techniques. One exciting thing that we've been pioneering is the ability to take a previously undetected signature and apply it to existing data without having to rescan systems. This is going to give us the ability to react much faster in a zero-day scenario where there is a previously undetected technology, and we're very excited about that. We are also working with Recorded Future to pair their detection technologies with ours. And additionally, as Wes indicated before, we will be making the situational awareness data available via the API in the near future. That is the state of play for situational awareness. I believe I am passing it now to Andrew to talk about custom labels.
Thank you very much, John. So custom labels is a quality of life update to the Risk Recon portal that we've been getting requests for from quite a few customers. So essentially, we have revamped the portfolio page. We still keep all of the previous foldering structure that you guys could still use, but customers are now empowered to search and filter by any labels that they create. And the way you would create labels would be the Label Manager tab under System Administration, where you'll be able to create as many labels as you want and also edit them to assign toes to those labels. And we believe, we hope this will kind of help customers uh, uh, in multiple ways, enabling clear ownership, reporting, and also workflows. Uh, yeah, that's about it. Open questions.
All right. We did have a couple questions in chat that we have answered, but if you have other questions, please type those into chat or reach out to us directly. Thanks, Andrew. So the last thing we want to cover today, and let me go to the next slide here, is how we'll interact with you all, how you can contact us. Everything we release that we send out, you will see release notes via email, but we also add those to our support portal. So if you go into Risk Recon, you do have to log in to get to the support portal, but you can see all release notes in that portal. For customer events, those are typically handled through Zoom registration. So for things like future roadmaps, please go in, please register via Zoom registration. After today, if you think of questions later that we haven't answered, please reach out to us directly. You can always reach out to us at support@riskrecon.com, and we will get back to you and respond to those questions. So if there are no other items, we will conclude this session. Do want to thank everyone for attending today. We really appreciate your participation and your attendance. We'll have another roadmap session here in another quarter, and then we will continue to have working groups. So thank you everyone again, and we'll stay on the line here for another couple minutes if there are any open questions. All right. I am not seeing any more questions in either the chat or the Q&A. Oh, I do see something coming in from John. John, were there specific updates that you had questions about? Great question, John. Yeah, updates on large cloud providers. So that's actually something we met about yesterday, and we're talking about probably over the next quarter. There is going to be some updates to how we attribute assets for large cloud providers. We're looking at really two different options on how we can attribute those assets. So today, if you go into an AWS or an Oracle, Very often you'll see the scores it can be somewhat low. And the reason for that is some of the IT assets that those organizations owned, while they own them, they are not necessarily using them. Those can be used by third parties that are essentially leasing those from those hosting providers. Today, the way that works is the issues that are detected on those assets that are being used by the third parties, those are still attributed to the hosting providers. And what that has resulted in is sort of a level of deflation of the overall scores for AWS or Oracle, for example. What we're looking to do, and we have our data science team looking at this right now, is how we can essentially carve out those issues that are really the result of third parties using those IT assets. And rather than attributing those to the hosting providers, attribute those to the third parties that are using those assets. So we have a couple different ways we're looking at that. One is essentially removing those assets and those issues from the overall rating. The second is rather than removing those IT assets, those assets would continue to be attributed to the hosting providers, but the underlying issues would essentially be attributed to the third parties that are leasing those IT assets. And so, yes, probably within the next couple of months, we will have some enhancements to how we attribute assets to those hosting providers. Another question. There's static IP. So how would RiskRecon help us identify? John or Neil, do you on the question here on static IPs?
Is this
Just
static IP? Oh, go ahead, Neil.
well, if you have something to respond to, I go ahead.
I was going to ask a clarifying question. Is this a third-party static IP, or are you talking about a static IP that you own? So those IPs should surface within a report as the responding IP for a host name that you own. And so that data should be available both within the data downloads as well as the IT profile for any of your vendors.
Okay, yeah, please please email us if you have more questions about that. So I don't think there's any more open questions. If not, we will probably conclude for today. But again, thanks everyone for your participation. There'll be another roadmap here next quarter. Be on the lookout for threat pressure in, oh, John. Associating specific assets with specific vendor products. So that's the concept of products or reporting on products. Obviously today in RiskRecon, that information is not part of the portal. That is something that Recorded Future does, however. So not only are they essentially scoring risk at a vendor and a subsidiary level, but they also score risk at a product and service level. So if you go into Recorded Future's third-party intelligence module, let's say you're looking at Microsoft, they are categorizing and rating risk for the underlying products. So things like MS Word or Excel or PowerPoint, there is risk there. That is something we are looking at, how we can leverage part of that information into RiskRecon. I don't have a firm timeline for you on that, but that is something that we're evaluating is how we can rate and report on risk at a product level or an engagement level. We are seeing more and more of that within the customers we work with. Very often engagements, they're essentially identifying risk at the underlying product and service level. So yes, that is something we're evaluating, and we will look to figure out how we can enhance and bring that to within the RiskRecon product. Yeah, you bet. Thanks for the questions. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions today, we'll go ahead and conclude the session. Thank you again, everyone who participated. If you have questions, please again, feel free to reach out to us at support@riskrecon.com, and looking forward to seeing you all at the next roadmap session. Thanks so much.